What if a single moment, a slip, a scalpel, a spark of electricity could unlock a hidden genius buried within us? We begin not with science fiction, but with a quiet collection of real stories that challenge everything we know about the human brain. These are not tales of lab-grown enhancements or futuristic implants. They are, instead, accidents. Brain surgeries gone sideways. Head traumas survived against the odds. Yet from these traumas emerged something impossible: musical brilliance, fluent language, quantum calculation, and visions of parallel dimensions. These are not isolated cases of recovery. They are transformations. A salesman who hits his head on a pool bottom and becomes a concert-level pianist. A boy who wakes up from brain surgery speaking fluent Mandarin with no exposure to the language. A teacher who couldn't do long division suddenly solving complex equations in her sleep. What lies at the heart of these stories is a question we can no longer ignore. Is there a deeper architecture in the human brain, a latent code, that holds abilities far beyond what we access in daily life? For over a century, neuroscience has explored the brain with the tools of deduction and imaging. We've mapped its structures, charted its regions, and classified its functions. Yet what these 10 stories reveal is a truth no scan can fully explain: that the brain can spontaneously rewire itself to access abilities most of us never touch, and that rewiring often comes through trauma. Why? Perhaps the brain is more like a symphony than a machine, full of unplayed instruments and hidden harmonies. Most of us follow the same melody our entire lives. But what happens when something disrupts the conductor? What if a misfired impulse, a severed pathway, or a sudden silence allows another instrument to take the lead? Each of the people you're about to meet underwent a moment that should have ended their normal lives. And in a way, it did. But instead of shutting down, their brains rerouted, rebooted, and in doing so, revealed something extraordinary. This series is not about sensational miracles or fringe science. It is a reflection on possibility, on the mystery of how the mind can rewrite itself in ways that surpass training, learning, even logic. Each chapter begins with a scene, unfolds a human transformation, and ends with a question we're still struggling to answer. It's a journey through music, language, numbers, senses, memory, emotion, and time itself. And it leaves us wondering, if these abilities are possible through accidental trauma, what might be achievable through deliberate understanding? As we begin, let this question echo. What if the boundaries of human potential are not biological walls, but locked doors, and these cases are the first accidental keys? It started with a dive, a shallow pool, a sharp crack. In 2002, Derek Amato, a 39-year-old salesman with no musical training, hit his head on the bottom of a swimming pool. He lost consciousness. Days later, in a hospital bed, he awoke to a silence that would soon fill with sound, not from the world outside, but from within. 2 weeks after the accident, Amato wandered into a friend's house and saw a piano. On impulse, he sat down. And then something strange happened. His fingers moved with purpose. Music poured out, intricate, layered, emotional compositions. Not random key mashing or childhood memory. Full pieces, as if drawn from somewhere deep and ancient. He couldn't read music, had never played before. Yet there he was, composing like someone who'd studied for decades. Doctors were baffled. Scans showed damage to his left hemisphere, the region typically associated with language and logic. But alongside the damage, something more elusive appeared: hyperconnectivity. Neural pathways had rerouted, lighting up areas responsible for auditory imagery, pattern recognition, and motor coordination. His brain had become a kind of musical engine. The melodies didn't come from memory. They were original and constant. They flowed through him, even in sleep. Sometimes he would wake with entire compositions already formed in his mind. At other times, he played while speaking, solving problems, or simply thinking about something else. It was as though a parallel system had taken root, entirely independent of conscious thought. Professional musicians studied his work. The compositions weren't just beautiful. They were mathematically sophisticated, structurally sound, and emotionally rich. The kind of music that normally requires both talent and decades of discipline. Dr. Barrett Brogard, a neuroscientist at the University of Miami, called it acquired savant syndrome, a rare condition in which brain injury unlocks abilities hidden in the architecture of the mind. Amato, she believed, had developed access to latent musical structures encoded in the brain, but inaccessible under ordinary conditions. But that raises the deeper question: how could a brain acquire skills it had never learned? One theory suggests that all human brains possess dormant potentials, unused neural scaffolding, like empty rooms in an abandoned cathedral. Trauma, in disrupting normal pathways, might activate these hidden spaces. Another theory points to quantum-level information fields, systems that operate outside ordinary memory, tapping into patterns not stored in personal experience. Whatever the explanation, Derek Amato's transformation suggests that genius is not always built. Sometimes it is triggered. Even more astonishing, his abilities evolved. Over time, his music grew more complex. His sense of harmony deepened. His compositions became emotionally layered in ways that reflected personal growth, as if his rewired brain continued to adapt and create. So we are left with this. What if inside every mind there is a hidden artist, a dormant genius, waiting not for instruction, but for disruption? And more haunting still, what price must be paid to hear the music we never knew we carried within us? What if the brain could speak languages it never learned? In a quiet Oklahoma hospital, a 9-year-old boy named Christopher Langan lay unconscious after a routine brain surgery. The operation, meant to remove a benign tumor in his left temporal lobe, had gone smoothly. But when he awoke, the room changed. Christopher opened his eyes and began to speak, in perfect Mandarin Chinese. The surgical team froze. No one had ever taught him the language. He had no Chinese heritage, no immersion, no prior exposure. Yet there he was, conversing fluently with Dr. Chen, the anesthesiologist. His tones were precise, his grammar flawless. He understood jokes, idioms, even obscure cultural references. The miracle didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, Christopher displayed comprehension of Japanese, then Korean, then Arabic, Hindi, Latin, Russian, languages he had never heard, let alone studied. And not just speech, comprehension, writing, syntax, and historical knowledge. Doctors were stunned. How could this child, barely old enough to master English grammar, suddenly access knowledge that normally requires years of education? Dr. Ellen Y. at Boston College took up the case. Brain imaging revealed something extraordinary. The surgical removal of Christopher's tumor had damaged language centers in his left hemisphere. Yet this damage had triggered a flood of new connections in adjacent regions tied to linguistic pattern recognition and memory. The trauma had, quite literally, rewired his language network, but there was something deeper at work. Christopher's brain was not learning languages, it was retrieving them. When he spoke Arabic, he demonstrated cultural and religious understanding. When he switched to Latin, he referenced historical contexts and literature. It was as if the languages came with memory. This led researchers to an astonishing hypothesis. Christopher's brain might have tapped into a universal linguistic code, a foundational structure theorized by Noam Chomsky as universal grammar, the idea that all human languages are built upon innate patterns coded into our biology. Perhaps the surgery didn't implant knowledge, but removed the barriers that kept it hidden. Linguists who interviewed Christopher found that he could identify root similarities between distant languages, detect structural relationships between words he had never seen, and invent plausible grammar for completely new tongues. And it wasn't just theoretical. His abilities were practical, usable, alive. Over time, Christopher developed the power to learn entirely new languages within days. What takes most people years, he could absorb in a weekend. His mind didn't treat language as information. It treated it as sensation, as something felt, not taught. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Perhaps buried in every human mind lies a linguistic architecture deeper than culture, deeper than memory, a cognitive blueprint for communication, waiting for the right neurological alignment to bring it to life. And if that's true, we must ask, are we really monolingual beings? Or are we simply locked out of the vast linguistic vault and coded into the brain's earliest architecture? Christopher Langan's transformation challenges the idea that genius must be earned. It suggests instead that we are all born fluent, in silence, until something, somehow, finds the key. She woke up doing math no one could explain. Janet Morrison was a 43-year-old English teacher with a fear of long division. Numbers had always made her anxious. She preferred poetry, metaphor, and language, not equations. But everything changed after a surgery to remove a vascular malformation from her right parietal lobe. When she opened her eyes post-op, the world looked different. Shapes had structure. Movement had rhythm. Numbers made sense. Within hours, Janet was solving advanced mathematical problems. Not just solving, intuitively understanding. She could factor enormous prime numbers in her head, manipulate calculus-level equations she'd never studied, and visualize geometric patterns that existed only in theory. The staff thought it was delirium, but the clarity only deepened. Doctors ran tests. Her calculations were correct, often more elegant than computer-generated ones. When asked to explain how she knew the answers, she'd pause and say, "I can see it." To Janet, math had become a landscape. She didn't compute. She navigated. Dr. Barrett Brogard, the same neuroscientist who studied Derek Amato, took a keen interest in her case. Brain imaging revealed a fascinating shift. Damage in Janet's right parietal cortex had created new neural pathways that bypassed typical step-by-step reasoning. Her brain was solving problems through spatial and pattern-based processing, using parallel systems previously unknown in neurological literature. She wasn't just faster, she was different. Mathematical savants are rare. Acquired mathematical savants? Even rarer. But what stunned researchers most was the precision of Janet's abilities. She could extract square roots to dozens of decimal places instantly, determine the day of the week for any historical date, and even see equations as moving, rotating objects in space, like sculpture made of logic. Her thinking was not linear, it was multidimensional. Professional mathematicians reviewed her work and discovered something unexpected. Janet was solving problems with methods no one had taught her. Some were new, unpublished. Her brain was creating mathematics, not just replicating it. Even more extraordinary, she began teaching others. Not the formulas, but the intuition. Through guided visualization techniques, turning numbers into images, shapes, patterns, she helped students with no math background improve dramatically. Her gift, it seemed, was partially transferable. Which led to a profound question. Could all humans access deeper mathematical intuition if only our brains were wired the right way? Janet's case suggested the brain might contain a hidden interface for numbers, a visual, geometric language for understanding the world through pure relation and form, one that formal education rarely touches. As researchers studied her, they noted something else. Her brain's activity patterns were operating at frequencies that hinted at quantum-level processing. That is, Her mind might be computing not just with neurons, but with information fields beyond ordinary physics. And so the question lingers, what is math, really? A human invention or a perception obscured by our own limitations? Janet Morrison's transformation reminds us that numbers may not just live in books or equations. They may be part of our very structure, awaiting a spark, a shift, a moment of trauma that becomes revelation. What if brilliance is not about mastering numbers, but remembering them? It began with silence, then returned as everything. 14-year-old Marcus Chen had suffered from severe epilepsy most of his life. His seizures were increasing in frequency and danger, and doctors recommended a surgical procedure to remove damaged tissue from his hippocampus, the brain's memory center. What happened during that surgery would change the way we think about memory itself. Midway through the operation, Dr. Sarah Martinez applied a mild electrical stimulation to an adjacent region. Marcus was awake under local anesthesia. As the current passed through his brain, he gasped. "I remember everything," he whispered. The medical team thought he meant the past week. But as the hours passed and his recovery continued, it became clear. Marcus could recall every single moment of his life since the procedure, in perfect, vivid detail. Conversations, smells, emotions, background noise, the exact position of furniture, the weather outside, what he was wearing, all of it locked into crystalline recall. And it didn't fade. Weeks later, researchers tested him. They asked what he'd eaten for lunch on a specific day, what books were on a shelf in a room he'd only visited once, what people said in conversations he had barely noticed at the time. Every answer was precise. Dr. James McGaugh at UC Irvine called it total autobiographical memory, but even that didn't capture the scope. Marcus didn't just remember visually, he remembered in full sensory immersion. The taste of food, the weight of emotion, the friction of clothing. Time had become a living archive. Brain scans revealed something astonishing. Marcus's hippocampus and surrounding temporal regions were operating at levels of connectivity never seen before. It wasn't just better memory. It was a different kind of memory. His brain had stopped filtering. It was recording everything indiscriminately in high fidelity. Normally, the human brain is selective. We forget details to preserve mental efficiency. Marcus's mind had abandoned that protocol. His consciousness had become a perfect recorder, a biological archive of continuous experience. But there was more. As Marcus adjusted to his new perception, he began to notice patterns, recurring motifs in conversation, subtle correlations between events. His brain wasn't just storing memory, it was analyzing it, finding connections others missed. He began predicting behavior, anticipating outcomes. His internal database of experience had grown so precise that he could model future events based on past patterns, not through intuition, but analysis. Researchers began to suspect something deeper at work: quantum coherence in memory formation. Marcus's brain may have been accessing not just neural pathways, but information fields that processed and stored memory beyond conventional brain matter, and unlike savants who lose other abilities in exchange for one, Marcus remained balanced, social, creative, curious. He had simply added a dimension to his cognition, a timeline, perfectly preserved. So what does this mean for memory? That it's not fixed in capacity. That the brain's true potential may be far beyond selective recall. That forgetting is not a flaw, but a safeguard, one that, if removed, reveals just how much we truly experience. Marcus Chen's transformation forces us to rethink everything we know about memory. What if every moment we live is still there, not lost, just inaccessible? What if the past is not gone, but waiting? And the bigger question, are we forgetting who we are? simply because it's more comfortable than remembering it all. Can you taste justice, see the shape of sound, feel emotions as texture? In 2018, during a delicate surgery to remove a brain aneurysm near her temporal lobe, 34-year-old violinist Sarah Kim experienced something that no patient or doctor could have anticipated. As surgical instruments brushed neural tissue, Sarah, conscious under local anesthesia, began to describe music in color. She could see chords as shifting geometric shapes. The sound of metal tools had flavor. Pain had hue. Emotions became texture. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity. When Sarah fully recovered, the phenomenon didn't go away. It intensified. She could see sound, taste mathematical equations, feel abstract ideas as physical sensations. Her world had transformed into a cascade of interconnected senses, a condition known as synesthesia, but in her case, far more extreme and complex than anything previously recorded. Dr. V.S. Ramachandran, a leading neuroscientist in sensory perception, examined Sarah and confirmed that her synesthetic experiences were consistent, repeatable, and mapped across multiple senses. She wasn't imagining these experiences. Her brain had rewired itself to perceive reality in multidimensional streams. Functional imaging revealed massive hyperconnectivity between her sensory cortices. Normally, sight, sound, touch, and taste are processed in distinct regions. In Sarah's brain, they were unified. A neural network of cross-modal integration that allowed her to experience concepts, music, and emotions through all senses at once. She could identify musical notes not just by pitch, but by their exact shape and color. A minor chord was deep blue with jagged edges. A major seventh was golden and smooth. Mathematical functions had flavor. Emotions came as pressure and heat in specific parts of her body. It wasn't random. It followed patterns. And these patterns unlocked more than perception. They enhanced performance. Sarah's musical compositions became more intricate, not just emotionally, but structurally. She could write scores by drawing color maps, harmonize melodies by mixing sensory flavors, improvise based on how emotions felt in her skin. But the transformation didn't stop with music. She began using her synesthesia to solve abstract problems. She memorized complex data by converting it into shapes and tastes. She diagnosed emotional states in others by reading the texture of their voice. Her brain had created a new perceptual language, one that operated beyond words, beyond logic, a multisensory matrix of understanding. Researchers studying Sarah found evidence of quantum coherence effects in her sensory processing, suggesting that her neural systems were sharing information in ways that exceeded classical brain function. Her mind wasn't just enhanced, it was entangled. Most strikingly, Sarah began teaching others. Through guided meditation and sensory training, she helped people access limited forms of cross-sensory perception. Students began to associate numbers with colors, emotions with spatial forms, and even hear shapes. It wasn't permanent, but it showed that her abilities weren't entirely unique. They were, in some form, human potential. So what does this say about consciousness? That our senses may not be separate lanes, but threads of one vast tapestry. That human perception is capable of far greater richness, if only the brain's internal borders are dissolved. Sarah Kim's transformation reminds us that the world is not made of isolated signals. It is one unfolding experience. And perhaps, beneath the surface of normality, we all carry the instruments to play it in full. What if seeing more doesn't mean adding new tools, but opening the doors between the ones we already have? He could see patterns no one else could, not just in numbers, but in time. Robert Park, a 28-year-old data analyst, went into surgery to remove a benign tumor pressing against his frontal lobe. Before the procedure, he was a capable but unremarkable analyst. Numbers made sense, but he had no particular genius. No glimpses into the future. That changed the moment the tumor came out. As he recovered, Robert began noticing things, subtle patterns, probabilities. The random number generators used in his post-operative equipment no longer felt random. He could predict their output. Then came something stranger. He began forecasting market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy, minutes, then hours, before they happened. Soon, it wasn't just numbers. Robert began anticipating decisions, weather changes, even small-scale events, like a friend's unexpected arrival or the outcome of a shuffled deck of cards. It wasn't guesswork, it was precision. Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences studied Robert's case and confirmed that his predictive abilities exceeded chance by orders of magnitude. The surgery had damaged parts of his frontal cortex, but, as in other cases, created new neural pathways, this time linked to temporal and pattern processing regions. Functional scans showed activity in parts of the brain usually dormant, areas associated with time perception, attention, and what some researchers call temporal intuition. But Robert wasn't just sensing time. He was sampling it. His brain appeared to be accessing information from future probability states, not as visions or feelings, but as structured data, a kind of intuitive computation that let him read the most likely outcomes of unfolding events. He wasn't infallible, but he was astonishingly accurate. When tested under controlled conditions, Robert could predict dice rolls, stock ticks, and even spontaneous human choices with consistency far beyond statistical norms. The effect grew stronger during emotionally charged moments, global events, local disasters, or personal stress, as if his consciousness became entangled with something larger than himself. Researchers began to suspect quantum processes at play. His brain might have been interacting with probability fields in ways that classical physics can't explain. Quantum entanglement, they theorized, might allow information from future states to correlate with present brain activity, creating a feedback loop across time. And Robert wasn't passive in this ability. He began refining it, training it. Through focused meditation and attention techniques, he improved his predictive clarity. He developed methods to tune into specific types of patterns: economic, social, emotional. Eventually, he began teaching others. Those who trained with him reported subtle but measurable improvements in decision-making, intuition, and anticipatory awareness. It wasn't prophecy, it was perception, expanded. So what does this suggest about time? That it may not be a straight line, that our brains, under the right conditions, can access more than just memory. They can feel the shape of what's coming. Robert Park's transformation asks us to reconsider what it means to know something. Is knowledge always about the past, or can it reach forward into the probable, the nearly formed? And if we can glimpse the future, even as a whisper, what responsibility comes with hearing it? Can one person feel the pain, joy, and thoughts of another as if they were their own? Margaret Foster was a 52-year-old nurse with a gentle presence and a gift for comforting patients. Empathy had always come naturally to her, but after a sudden stroke and emergency brain surgery, something shifted. She began to feel more than emotion. She began to experience other people's consciousness. The procedure had been life-saving, a craniotomy to relieve pressure from brain swelling. During surgery, doctors removed tissue from her right parietal lobe, a region tied to spatial awareness and self-other distinction. In the weeks following her recovery, Margaret noticed something she couldn't explain. She could sense what others were feeling, not through expression, but directly. An anxious colleague walked past, and Margaret felt tightness in her chest. A grieving patient sat silently, and she was overwhelmed by sorrow before a word was spoken. Soon, she began to sense physical sensations, a backache here, a migraine there, that matched the conditions of those around her. But it didn't stop there. She began hearing people's thoughts, not in sentences, but impressions, knowing what someone was about to say before they spoke, detecting lies, unspoken fears, or buried memories. At first, it terrified her. Then it transformed her. Dr. Marco Iacoboni, a pioneer in mirror neuron research at UCLA, studied Margaret's case and found that her mirror neuron systems had become hyperactive, to an extent never seen in any subject. Her brain synchronized with others during interaction, creating a shared neural resonance that mimicked their emotional and cognitive states. Her scans showed real-time mirroring of brain activity. When someone near her felt fear, her amygdala lit up. When they recalled a memory, her hippocampus mirrored the pattern. It was as if her brain had become porous, open to others. But it wasn't chaotic. It was precise. She could distinguish between her own thoughts and those of others. She learned to control the volume of this inner empathy, to tune in or pull back. It wasn't telepathy. It was intersubjectivity, taken to the extreme. And it came with a gift: healing. Margaret began using her ability to help patients work through emotional trauma. By feeling their pain directly, she could help them name it, confront it, and release it. She became a kind of emotional translator, helping people understand themselves by becoming, briefly, them. Researchers proposed that Margaret's brain had developed quantum-level entanglement with other minds, that her neural networks were synchronizing through non-local correlations, allowing for direct information exchange. It was unprecedented, but the effects were undeniable. Her empathy extended beyond emotions. When she stood near experts, surgeons, musicians, linguists, she could temporarily access their knowledge, perform techniques she'd never learned, understand ideas she'd never studied. It was as though her consciousness could plug into theirs, borrowing understanding. She began teaching others how to deepen empathy. Through breathwork, presence, and focused awareness, she guided students in building stronger social attunement. Many reported feeling more connected, more intuitive, more compassionate. Margaret Foster's transformation opens a door into something profound, that empathy may not be metaphor, that the boundaries between self and other might be thinner than we imagine. If one mind can touch another, truly, directly, then what are we, really? Is identity fixed, or is it a shared dance of awareness, always moving, always merging? And in a world defined by isolation, what becomes possible when we finally feel each other, not just emotionally, but neurologically? What if the mind could run quantum equations, with no calculator, no chalkboard, just thought? At 16, Alex Rivera was an ordinary physics student, bright, curious, but unremarkable. He loved science, but struggled with advanced math. Then came a brain tumor, rare, pressing into his parietal lobe. Surgery was his only option. During the delicate procedure, Dr. Rebecca Chen applied electrical stimulation to a region near Alex's parietal cortex. What happened next was not expected. When he awoke, Alex began writing equations. Not just high school problems, but quantum field models, orbital configurations, Schrödinger solutions, concepts even his doctors couldn't follow. He didn't understand how he knew. The answers were simply there. He could visualize entangled particles, calculate wave function collapses, predict tunneling probabilities in seconds, problems that took quantum physicists hours or days with computers. It wasn't memorization, it was computation. His mind had become a quantum calculator. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, a specialist in consciousness and quantum brain theory, reviewed Alex's case. The findings were staggering. Alex's brain appeared to be operating through quantum coherence in microtubules, tiny structures inside neurons, long thought to assist with internal support, now suspected of hosting quantum processes. Where typical brains calculate linearly, Alex's neural patterns showed signs of superposition, holding multiple solutions at once, and collapsing into answers with elegant precision. His mental activity bypassed normal step-by-step logic, functioning more like a quantum processor than a biological brain, and he could teach. Alex began sharing techniques, not math tricks, but states of mind. He guided students through meditative focus, helping them feel the structure of problems, to sense relationships rather than crunch numbers. Slowly, others began seeing improvements in conceptual thinking. It wasn't about being smarter. It was about accessing a different mode of awareness. Alex described it as tuning in, like a radio, to fields of possibility, letting go of control, letting answers surface. His thoughts didn't unfold in sentences or symbols, but in spatial forms, dynamic relationships, and quantum motion. He said, "The equations aren't written, they're experienced." Quantum physicists who consulted with him found themselves challenged. His intuition suggested relationships not yet formally discovered. His insights sometimes aligned with speculative theories in development. Other times, they ventured into new, unexplored territory. What if, they wondered, quantum computation isn't exclusive to machines? What if the human brain, and under the right conditions, can function as a quantum system? If that's true, then the limits of cognition might not be computational, but attentional. We might not need more neurons, just a new way to listen. Alex Rivera's transformation suggests a profound possibility, that within each of us may lie a quantum interface, a channel into the mathematical structure of reality itself. And if such power can emerge from a single flicker of electricity during surgery, then what latent systems are sleeping in the rest of us? What if thought isn't confined to matter, but entangled with the very fabric of the universe? And what happens when we learn not to calculate, but to resonate? Can we remember lives we never lived? Dr. Elena Vasquez, a 31-year-old historian, underwent a routine surgical procedure to treat her temporal lobe epilepsy. As part of the operation, electrodes were briefly used to stimulate her hippocampus, the brain's memory gateway. What happened afterward was unlike anything recorded in medical literature. She began having memories. But they weren't hers. She saw vivid scenes of 19th-century kitchens, conversations in dialects she'd never learned, the scent of leather, wood smoke, unfamiliar spices, emotional experiences, joy, grief, hunger, tied to places and times far beyond her own life. At first, they came in dreams. Then, while she was awake, doctors assumed hallucinations. But the memories persisted, rich with sensory detail and historical accuracy. She described furniture arrangements, family rituals, and even local songs from villages she had never studied. Locations matched real places. Cultural elements matched historical records. The memories, she realized, belonged to her ancestors. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, known for his work on morphic resonance, studied her case. He proposed that her consciousness had accessed inherited memory, not metaphorically, but biologically. Her DNA, triggered by the surgical stimulation, had activated neural pathways linked to ancestral information encoded in her genetic material. Genetic memory had long been a controversial concept, dismissed by many as pseudoscience. But Elena's case brought new credibility. Her experiences weren't vague impressions. They were precise, experiential recollections, lived moments, complete with tactile and emotional resonance. Scans revealed that her brain was bypassing conventional memory systems. Instead of retrieving information from personal experience, it was accessing storage embedded in her cells. Patterns passed down through generations, like biological archives waiting to be read. And it wasn't just passive recall. The knowledge came with skills. When she accessed memories of a great-grandfather who was a carpenter, she could suddenly use woodworking tools she'd never touched. Another lineage brought knowledge of herbal medicine, old languages, and regional dances. She became fluent in Italian, a dialect spoken by a grandmother she'd never met. Her pronunciation matched regional accents. She cooked dishes from memory. She knew family histories no one had told her. It was as if history had come alive inside her. But perhaps most extraordinary, Elena began helping others access their own ancestral memories. Through meditation and guided visualization, she led participants into states where they reported vivid recollections, not of fantasy, but of plausible family history. Some discovered details later verified by relatives or archives. This raised a question with vast implications. Is memory a personal library or a shared biological one? If our DNA holds not just physical traits, but experiential echoes, what does that mean for our identity? Are we singular minds, or the living chorus of those who came before us? Dr. Vasquez's transformation reframes ancestry. It is no longer just genetics or tradition, but consciousness itself, threaded through time. And if the past lives within us, what else might be waiting, locked in the spiral staircase of our genetic code? What if remembering isn't always about looking back, but reaching inward to find the lives that shaped us from within? What if you could see the choices you didn't make, and the lives you might have lived? Michael Thompson was a 45-year-old artist struggling with treatment-resistant depression. Years of therapy and medication had brought little relief. As a last resort, he enrolled in an experimental program using deep brain stimulation, targeted electrical impulses delivered to specific neural regions. During a session targeting areas near the subgenual cingulate cortex, Michael gasped. He was no longer in the room. He described seeing a version of his studio, but different. A painting he hadn't painted, a layout he'd never arranged. The light, the time of day, everything was subtly altered. Then the image shifted. Another version. Then another. Michael wasn't hallucinating. He was viewing alternate versions of his reality, parallel dimensions unfolding simultaneously, each one shaped by different decisions, chance events, or emotional shifts. Dr. Amanda Foster, the neurosurgeon overseeing his treatment, initially dismissed it as a side effect. But Michael's descriptions were too precise. He began drawing what he saw: cityscapes with unfamiliar architecture, alternate political histories, variations of friends and family with different lives. His artwork was so detailed that quantum physicists took notice. Dr. Fred Alan Wolf, known for his work on quantum consciousness, reviewed the phenomenon. He proposed that Michael's brain had begun to interface with the quantum multiverse, the many worlds interpretation of reality, where every possible outcome of every decision spawns a new timeline. Brain imaging revealed that Michael's visual cortex and temporal regions were exhibiting unusual activity, patterns consistent with quantum tunneling simulations. His neural networks appeared to be sampling information from parallel probability fields. It wasn't imagination. It was perception of the multiverse. Michael reported viewing decisions as spatial paths. When he focused, he could trace backward through choices and see their alternate branches. What would have happened had he said yes instead of no, stayed instead of left, spoken instead of remained silent? And it wasn't just the past. He could look forward, seeing probable futures, shaped by small shifts in attention or action, not as fixed destinies but as branching timelines of possibility. He described it as stepping outside time and watching it unfold like a kaleidoscope. Independent researchers confirmed that his experiences correlated with emerging theories in quantum cognition, the idea that consciousness may exist across superposed states, collapsing only when we focus. Michael's transformation didn't just expand his art, it expanded his life. He began to heal, not through erasing his depression, but by understanding it across dimensions. He saw versions of himself who had made peace, found meaning, or changed course. He painted their stories. In doing so, he began to shift his own, and he began teaching others, not how to see other dimensions, but how to sense possibility, how to expand perception beyond the linear. His workshops helped people reframe their choices as part of a vast web, empowering them to explore new paths. Michael Thompson's experience suggests that reality may be wider than we know, that the life we live is not the only one, but the one we focus on. And if that's true, then every regret, every what-if, every turning point is not a closed door, but a doorway to another version of ourselves. What becomes possible when we stop asking, "What if?" and start listening to the answers unfolding all around us? How far does human potential truly reach? And what happens when we accidentally step beyond its edge? The 10 cases we've explored are not fantasy. They are real people, real transformations, each triggered by a moment that should have broken them, and instead broke open something hidden. From a salesman who becomes a composer, to a boy fluent in forgotten languages. A teacher who awakens a mathematical mind, a child who remembers everything. A violinist who senses reality in shape and flavor. A man who sees time before it unfolds. A nurse who shares consciousness with others. A teenager whose brain mirrors quantum computation. A historian who walks through ancestral memory. And an artist who glimpses infinite lives. What unites them is not what they became, but how they became it, not through study, not through willpower, but through disruption. In each case, the catalyst was injury, surgery, or stimulation, an event that interrupted normal brain function and revealed an extraordinary ability. These were not enhancements, they were unveilings. It raises a difficult and thrilling possibility that our ordinary consciousness is only a sliver of what the human brain contains. Neuroscience has long operated under a model of limitation, that we use only what evolution gave us, and that what lies beyond is unreachable. But these cases challenge that. They suggest the brain is not a fixed machine, but a dynamic, multidimensional instrument, and most of its strings remain silent. So the question becomes, why? Why would we carry these hidden capacities? Why would our architecture include musical mastery, linguistic fluency, quantum calculation, and interdimensional perception, only to hide them behind locked doors? Perhaps the brain is conservative by design, filtering experience to protect us from overload. Or perhaps we are shaped by culture to ignore what doesn't fit. But trauma, in all its chaos, bypasses filters. It shakes the architecture, and in rare cases, it rearranges the wiring. What's remarkable is not just that these transformations happen, but that they persist. These people did not burn bright and fade. Their abilities stabilized, evolved. Some even found ways to teach others, suggesting these capacities are not entirely unique, but latent. That brings us to a deeper mystery. If abilities this vast are accessible through accidental triggers, could they one day be accessed intentionally? Could we learn to unlock hidden memory, pattern recognition, cross-sensory perception, or quantum cognition through training, focus, or technology? We are on the edge of something profound. Not a new technology, but a new understanding of ourselves. The people in these stories didn't become more than human. They became fully human, in ways most of us never imagined possible. Their stories ask us not to marvel, but to reflect. What if our limits are not biological, but perceptual? What if genius is not something rare, but something we've simply forgotten how to access? And what becomes of humanity when we remember? Is it possible that the extraordinary is already within us, waiting not to be built, but remembered? In each of these transformations, the shift didn't come from invention, education, or effort. It came from interruption, from the unpredictable grace of chaos. A crack in the system, a gap in the loop, a wound that became a window. The man who composes music he's never heard. The child who speaks languages no one taught him. The teacher who sees numbers as form and motion. The boy who recalls time like a film reel. The violinist who lives in a sensory symphony. The analyst who predicts what hasn't happened. The nurse who merges with the minds of others. the student who solves equations by resonating with the quantum world, the historian who walks in the memories of the dead, the artist who glimpses alternate versions of himself. These are not mutations, they are revelations, and they share a haunting truth. Our brains, as they are, contain architectures we've never used, neural systems capable of perceiving, computing, and connecting far beyond what everyday consciousness allows. The key lies not in addition, but in access. In one sense, each story is about a specific gift, but in another, deeper sense, they're all about one thing: expanded awareness. Each person experienced a broadening of the self into sound, language, number, time, others, memory, possibility. They didn't gain superpowers. They uncovered dimensions of consciousness that may reside in us all. The implications are staggering. If trauma can rewire the brain to unlock genius, then the potential is already there. If certain meditative states can simulate parts of these experiences, then training may be possible. And if quantum effects are involved, then our consciousness might not be bound by neurons alone, but connected to fields of information that transcend the individual. What if memory, language, pattern, emotion, and even choice are not just mental events, but coordinates on a map we've barely begun to chart? Science, for all its power, still views the brain through the lens of limitations: finite capacity, fixed wiring, constrained abilities. But these stories hint at a different model, one of dormant architectures, of thresholds and emergence. And so we must ask, have we mistaken normal for complete? The people we've followed in this journey are rare, but perhaps not exceptional. Perhaps they are messengers, not of the future, but of the unrecognized present. Glimpses of what it means to be more fully conscious. If we can see the path they walked, however accidental, can we begin to walk it deliberately, not to become something else, but to become more deeply ourselves. And perhaps one day, the extraordinary won't be extraordinary anymore, just human, as we were always meant to be. What if the limits we live within are illusions, not walls of biology, but fences of habit? In the end, these stories leave us with more questions than answers, but perhaps that is their greatest gift. Derek Amato, whose brain rewired itself into a symphony. Christopher Langan, who awoke with the voices of forgotten languages in his throat. Janet Morrison, who saw numbers in the sky. Marcus Chen, who became a living archive of time. Sarah Kim, who felt the world with every sense at once. Robert Park, who read the rhythm of the future. Margaret Foster, who stepped into the minds of others. Alex Rivera, who calculated the cosmos inside his head. Elena Vasquez, who carried the memory of bloodlines past. Michael Thompson, who painted the echoes of parallel lives, 10 people, 10 awakenings, 10 glimpses into what it means to break open the brain and find a door. Their stories remind us that genius may not be a gift, but a glimpse, a fleeting window into what's always been there. Their transformations were not enhancements, but excavations, revealing vast structures buried beneath the surface of ordinary thought. This is not a call to romanticize trauma. Each of these people paid a price: pain, confusion, isolation. To gain what they did, they lost something familiar, but perhaps that is always the nature of transformation. The self dissolves and something larger steps forward, and now it is our turn to listen. To wonder what capacities lie dormant within our own minds. To question the architecture of thought we take for granted. To remember that we are not finished, not fixed, but fluid, evolving, and astonishing. Neuroscience has mapped the visible, but these stories speak of the invisible, the structures of possibility, the currents of potential, the whispers of a consciousness that stretches beyond time, beyond self, beyond what we've dared to imagine. And so we close with a question, not an answer. What if the future of human evolution isn't something that will happen to us, but something we can remember into being. Not by changing who we are, but by finally becoming what we've always been: human, whole, awake,